It was a typical Tuesday morning in the small town of Maplebrook, a place where life moved at a slower pace, and everyone seemed to know everyone else. The courthouse, a centuries-old building with tall columns and weathered stone, was busy as usual with a few local cases. Most of the people gathered that day were familiar faces: shop owners, teachers, farmers, folks who had lived here their whole lives. But today, something felt different. Monique Howard stood at the back of the courtroom, her presence standing in stark contrast to the sea of familiar faces. A black woman in a space where diversity was rare, her calm and measured appearance was the first hint that this case was not going to be like the others. She wore a dark blue dress, her hair pulled back neatly, her posture straight. She wasn't nervous. She had done this before. She had faced challenges before. But this was different. Monique was there to answer for an event she had organized just a few weeks prior. It wasn't the type of gathering the town's ordinance had anticipated. It was more than a social event. It was a conversation that needed to be had, a moment to shine light on issues of fairness, access, and equality that so many in Maplebrook had overlooked. A group of individuals, mostly from underrepresented communities, had come together to discuss the state of local opportunities and the struggles they faced. As Monique entered the courtroom, all eyes turned toward her. She could feel the weight of their stares, some curious, others skeptical, and a few judgmental. She was well aware of how she was perceived in this room. Judge Samuel Carter, a man in his late 50s who had served as the head of this courthouse for over a decade, sat high above everyone, his gavel resting firmly in front of him. He glanced up from his papers as Monique made her way to the stand. "Monique Howard," Judge Carter's voice echoed in the room, "you are here today for failing to secure the necessary permits for a public gathering. The fine for such an infraction is $500. How do you plead?" Monique took a deep breath, her calmness a sharp contrast to the judge's stern expression. She wasn't afraid, but she knew this wasn't just about a permit. It was about more than an infraction. It was about a larger conversation that had yet to be acknowledged. "I plead not guilty, Your Honor," she replied evenly. "The event I organized was a discussion, not a gathering. It wasn't about a crowd. It was about a conversation, one that this town desperately needs." Judge Carter raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "A conversation. Ms. Howard, the law is clear. Public gatherings require permits. Your event may have had good intentions, but the rules are the rules." Monique held his gaze, unflinching. She knew she had to tread carefully. Her words were about to matter more than ever. The silence in the courtroom grew thicker as Judge Carter scanned the papers in front of him, his brow furrowing slightly as he reread the charges. He had heard all sorts of excuses before. People claiming they didn't understand the law. People who thought the rules didn't apply to them. But Monique wasn't like most people. She didn't seem scared or apologetic, just resolute, as if she knew exactly how the conversation was going to play out. "You're asking for an exception, Ms. Howard," Judge Carter said, his tone more condescending than curious. "And exceptions are not something we make lightly here. The law is in place to maintain order. It doesn't bend just because someone wants to have a conversation. You had no permit, and you violated town regulations." Monique stood her ground, feeling the weight of every eye on her. This wasn't just a small legal issue. It was a clash of worldviews. She wasn't looking for sympathy or leniency, only for her intentions to be understood. Her voice remained calm, yet firm. "Your Honor, it's not about the permit. The gathering was about something much bigger. It was about addressing the struggles many people in this town face, issues that affect not just the people at the meeting, but everyone here. This wasn't a social event. It was an opportunity to discuss real challenges that affect how people live, work, and are treated in this town." Judge Carter's lips pressed together, his eyes narrowing slightly. He had heard of such discussions before, of course, but they were usually reserved for bigger cities, not the sleepy, conservative town of Maplebrook. The thought of those kinds of conversations happening here, on his watch, in his courtroom, seemed unsettling. The town had always prided itself on its way of life, its traditions, and Monique's words felt like an unspoken challenge to all of that. While I understand your perspective, Ms. Howard, it doesn't change the fact that rules were broken, he replied, his voice growing sterner. You're not the first person to think their cause justifies breaking the law. The law is here for a reason, and we cannot simply make exceptions because someone feels it's for a greater good. There are ways to address these issues, but this isn't one of them. Monique didn't flinch. She had expected this. She knew the judge would stick to the law, as he always had. But she also knew something deeper was at play. This wasn't just about a small fine. It was about the kinds of conversations this town had avoided for far too long. And if she had to pay the price for sparking that conversation, then so be it. Your Honor, she began again, her voice steady. Sometimes, the law isn't enough. Sometimes, you have to go beyond it to ensure that everyone has a voice. I wasn't breaking the law. I was trying to open a door that has been closed for far too long. The judge took a slow breath, his gaze lingering on her. He didn't respond immediately, but something in her words seemed to stir an uncomfortable thought in the back of his mind. As Monique stood there, facing the judge, her thoughts drifted briefly to the years leading up to this moment. The fine wasn't just the result of a single gathering. It was the culmination of years of advocacy, effort, and hard-won small victories that had never been fully recognized by those in power. Maplebrook might have seemed like a peaceful, tight-knit community on the surface, but beneath that quiet exterior, there were issues that many people had simply chosen to ignore. Monique had never been one to turn a blind eye. Her childhood had been a steady mix of love and struggle. Raised by parents who were deeply involved in the local church and community, Monique had learned early on about the power of standing up for what was right, even if it meant challenging the status quo. Her mother, a teacher at the local elementary school, had often brought home stories of the subtle ways people were excluded, whether it was in the classroom, at town meetings, or in everyday life. Her father, a small business owner, had always emphasized the importance of fairness in how people treated each other, no matter their background or station in life. As Monique grew older, she became more attuned to the quiet inequities around her. She began to see patterns, the ways people who looked like her were subtly sidelined, how certain issues were swept under the rug as if they didn't matter, and how the voices of those most affected were rarely heard. She started volunteering, helping to organize community events that brought people together, talked about issues others didn't want to touch, and highlighted concerns that had long been overlooked. She didn't start out thinking she was going to change the world, but over time, the truth became clear to her. Without change, there could be no real progress. The event she'd organized, which had now brought her here to this courtroom, wasn't just about speaking out for herself. It was about creating space for those who hadn't been able to speak up for years. It was about shining a light on the issues of inequality, opportunity, and access. While the town might have thought that people were content with the way things were, Monique knew better. She had heard the whispers of frustration, seen the quiet despair in the faces of those who didn't feel heard. The fine was more than a legal matter to her. It was a symbol of how deeply entrenched those issues were. To them, this was about a technicality, a simple mistake. But for Monique, it was a wake-up call, an urgent signal that these very laws and ordinances, meant to uphold order, were in fact reinforcing a system that often ignored the needs of the most vulnerable. As the judge continued to eye her from across the room, Monique's resolve only strengthened. She had made a decision long ago to speak out, to make waves, and she wasn't going to stop now. Not for this fine. Not for anyone. I didn't break the law to disrupt, Monique said, her voice clear and unwavering. I did it because the law, as it stands, doesn't address the needs of everyone in this town. And that's something we have to talk about. The judge paused, his eyes narrowing as her words hung in the air. For a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, and Monique felt a quiet stir in the air, a subtle shift, something intangible, but real. The courtroom was heavy with silence. Everyone was waiting for Judge Carter to respond. his hands folded in front of him, his eyes fixed on Monique. He didn't say anything at first, as if her words had left him momentarily speechless. But the pause wasn't out of contemplation. It was out of irritation. He had dealt with his share of defiant individuals, people who tried to twist the law to fit their personal agenda. But Monique wasn't just any defendant. She wasn't crying out for sympathy or trying to make excuses. She was calm, calculated, and every word she spoke seemed to challenge his assumptions about what justice meant in his courtroom. The murmurs from the back of the room were growing louder, subtle at first, as whispers spread between the few who had come to watch. The young lawyer who had been observing from the corner leaned over to his colleague, a low whisper escaping his lips. "Do you think he'll change his mind? It sounds like she's got a point." The colleague, a more seasoned attorney, shrugged but kept his eyes on the proceedings. "Hard to say. Judge Carter's set in his ways, but you can tell he's listening." It wasn't just the young lawyer who was noticing the tension shift. The bailiff, who had been standing near the door, seemed to have a hard time staying still. Even the court reporter was typing with an unusual intensity, as though every word might be crucial in the days to come. The town, so accustomed to quiet, everyday life, was suddenly becoming aware of the deeper layers of conflict Monique had brought to the surface. Judge Carter cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. His voice, though steady, carried an edge. "Ms. Howard, I appreciate your passion. I truly do. But passion doesn't excuse breaking the law. You say you're trying to bring attention to serious issues. Fine, but there's a proper way to do things. The law can't be overlooked because of personal beliefs or opinions." Monique didn't flinch. This wasn't her first time being dismissed by those in authority. She'd faced it before, both overt and subtle forms of rejection, and had learned that the only way forward was to keep pushing. If she didn't challenge the system now, who would? "The law, Your Honor, is meant to serve everyone equally," she said, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "But when laws are used to silence or overlook people, when they make it harder for those who are already disadvantaged to be heard, then we have a problem." Judge Carter shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had heard complaints like this before. But something about Monique's tone, her unwavering conviction, was unsettling. It wasn't just about a technical violation anymore. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She wasn't asking for leniency. She was challenging his very view of what justice should look like, and it was forcing him to confront his own biases. He glanced down at the papers in front of him again, struggling to find a clear path forward. But the words on the page no longer seemed to make sense. Instead, he found himself wondering if perhaps the law, as he had always interpreted it, wasn't enough. Was it truly serving everyone, or was it protecting the status quo? "Ms. Howard," he said finally, his voice less certain, "this isn't a court of ideals. It's a court of law. The law doesn't bend." But as he spoke, something in the room had already shifted. Monique hadn't just made a case for her own actions. She had made a case for something far more fundamental, something deeper, and the weight of that realization was starting to settle on everyone present. Monique could feel the shift in the room. Judge Carter's words may have been dismissive, but the undertone was different now. The atmosphere was no longer merely a courtroom. It had become a battleground of ideas, one where her cause was quietly gaining ground. She wasn't here to prove herself right. She was here to make sure that the conversations that needed to happen were finally heard. And if the judge wasn't ready to see it yet, then it was up to her to push the message further. "Your Honor," Monique began, her voice unwavering, but even more deliberate now. "I didn't come here today just to defend myself against a fine. I came here because I believe that the law you uphold doesn't always reflect the real needs of this community." Judge Carter leaned forward slightly, his hands still resting on his desk, but his eyes were focused on her with a newfound intensity. He was no longer simply listening to maintain order. Now, it seemed as if he was actually hearing her words. Monique continued, "There are people in this town who have lived here their whole lives, and who feel invisible. They're ignored because they don't have the resources to voice their concerns. They don't have access to the same opportunities, the same treatment as others. The event I organized, though informal, was an attempt to bring their voices into the light, to make sure that the issues they face aren't swept under the rug anymore. I'm not asking for a free pass. I'm asking for us to think about what fairness really means. Judge Carter's expression remained unreadable, but Monique noticed the subtle shift in his posture. The cold, detached aura he usually carried seemed to be loosening, as if her words were cracking through some of the walls he had built over the years. There was a slight hesitation in his response when he spoke again. So you believe that this discussion, as you call it, was worth breaking the law for? His voice was no longer as firm as it had been before, and the question now seemed more like a genuine inquiry than a challenge. Monique didn't miss a beat. Yes, Your Honor, I do. Sometimes, the laws we follow don't always protect the people who need it most. They might protect order, but not justice. I'm not trying to undermine the law. I'm trying to ask it to evolve, to include all of us. The room fell silent again. Monique could feel the weight of the eyes on her, but she didn't look away from Judge Carter. She had known from the start that her actions would cause discomfort, but it was that discomfort that created the space for change. If the town, the judge, and even the people sitting in the gallery were uncomfortable, then maybe that was a sign that it was time to rethink what they had always accepted as the way things are. Judge Carter shifted in his seat. There was a subtle tightness in his jaw as he processed her words. Monique could sense his internal conflict. His training had always taught him to separate personal belief from the letter of the law. But today, for the first time in a long while, those two things seemed to collide, leaving him to question whether following the law without considering its impact was enough. Monique didn't wait for his reply. She knew her words had already done their job. Now, it was up to the judge to decide whether he would remain anchored in his old ways or allow himself to be swayed by the reality that had been so carefully and quietly laid out before him. That evening, Judge Samuel Carter sat alone in his office, staring at the case file in front of him. The courthouse had emptied hours ago, but he hadn't moved from his desk. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above did little to break the silence that had settled in his mind. He had seen plenty of cases over the years, from petty infractions to more serious crimes, and had always prided himself on making decisions that were based strictly on the law. But Monique's case, her words, her unwavering confidence, it had stirred something inside him, something he wasn't sure how to name. He ran a hand over his face and leaned back in his chair. The words she had spoken echoed in his mind, over and over. The law is meant to serve everyone equally. He had heard similar arguments before, but never with such conviction, never with such clarity. It wasn't just the case of a woman challenging a fine. It was the way she had framed it, a question not just of the law, but of its fairness, its ability to truly protect everyone, not just the ones with the power to navigate it easily. Judge Carter had always believed in the rules. It was how he had built his reputation. A man who followed procedure, who didn't let emotions or personal beliefs cloud his judgment. But something about Monique's words had cracked through that certainty, like a pebble thrown into a still pond, sending ripples out into places he hadn't expected. What if the law he had spent his entire career upholding wasn't as perfect as he had always assumed? What if, by enforcing it rigidly, he had been unintentionally contributing to the very inequality Monique spoke of? He thought about the town of Maplebrook. It was small, close-knit, and proud of its traditions. Everyone had their place. But was that sense of order simply masking an unspoken divide? Was he, in his own way, upholding a system that gave comfort to some while leaving others at the margins? His mind wandered to the stories he had heard over the years. Rumors, whispers of people feeling left out, dismissed. Were those people's voices being drowned out because they weren't seen as valuable enough to be heard? Judge Carter ran his fingers through his hair, frustrated. The questions seemed endless. He wasn't sure what to do with them, or with the strange, uncomfortable feeling that had settled in his chest. He had spent years in this town, presiding over cases where everything felt straightforward, clear lines, clear consequences. But Monique had made him see something different. Her calm defiance had shown him a side of the law he hadn't truly acknowledged until now. It could be a tool of power, not just protection. As he sat there, the weight of his thoughts pressing in, he knew that he couldn't make a decision based purely on the old script he had followed for so long. He had to think beyond what was black and white. He had to think about the larger picture. The clock on his desk ticked on, the sound sharp and rhythmic. And with each tick, Judge Carter knew he was standing at a crossroads. The choice he would make tomorrow would be more than just a ruling on a fine. It would be a decision about what kind of judge and what kind of man he was willing to be. The following day, the courtroom was filled with the usual buzz of activity. People shuffled in and out, taking their seats, and the bailiff called the cases to order. The tension from yesterday's hearing still hung in the air, but this time it felt different. The crowd seemed expectant, almost curious. News of Monique's case had already spread through Maplebrook, and the people who had once been passive observers were now part of the larger conversation. Judge Carter entered the room, his robe swishing lightly behind him as he took his seat at the bench. He looked out at the gathered crowd, his face steady, but his mind still processing the weight of the decision he had to make. The gavel hit the surface of his desk with a decisive thud, silencing the room. "Let's proceed with the case of Monique Howard," he announced, his voice calm, but the words carried an air of uncertainty that no one had heard from him before. Monique stood again before the judge, her posture as dignified as it had been the day before. But today there was something different in her eyes, something that spoke of quiet hope, of a resolve that had only strengthened in the hours since their last exchange. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain. The conversation was already bigger than any of them. The conversation had already begun to shift. Judge Carter's eyes lingered on her for a moment before he looked down at the papers before him. The room was still. The gavel lay beside him, untouched for now. He cleared his throat, and the tension in the room seemed to tighten. "Ms. Howard," Judge Carter began, his voice steady, but with an unexpected warmth. "Yesterday, you spoke to this court about the need for fairness and the challenges that people face when their voices are not heard. You spoke about laws and their capacity to protect, and about the realities that are often overlooked." Monique's heart beat a little faster, but she didn't speak. She simply nodded, waiting. "After reviewing the facts of the case and reflecting on the points you raised, I have come to the conclusion that the penalty imposed on you is not in line with the spirit of what justice should be." A collective breath seemed to escape from the crowd. The room was quiet, every person leaning forward, hanging on the judge's next words. "Therefore, I am overturning the fine," he continued, his voice strong and clear. "However, I want to make it clear that this decision is not made lightly. It is made with the understanding that sometimes the law needs to be examined in a broader context, one that takes into account the voices of all people in this community." Monique's heart swelled with an emotion she hadn't anticipated. She had come into this courtroom expecting a ruling on a small infraction, but what she was hearing now was more than that. It was a recognition that the issues she had brought to the forefront were real, and that the law had to evolve if it was to serve everyone fairly. Judge Carter paused, his gaze shifting from the papers before him to the crowd and then back to Monique. "I also encourage you, Ms. Howard, to continue advocating for the issues you've raised, but to do so in a way that respects the processes in place, even as they evolve. This town, like every other, has room for growth." Monique's eyes locked with the judge's. He wasn't just speaking to her, he was speaking to the entire town. The gavel fell again, louder this time, signaling the end of the case, but also the beginning of something much larger. The ripples from that moment would be felt far beyond the walls of the courtroom, reaching into the everyday lives of the people who called Maplebrook home. It was the start of a new chapter for the town, one where questions about fairness, equality, and justice would no longer be ignored. As Monique left the courtroom, her heart still racing, she knew that the battle wasn't over. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope that the fight for change was not only possible, it was happening. The days following the ruling were filled with a quiet hum of anticipation in Maplebrook. The town had always been a place where the pace of life was predictable, and change came slowly, if at all. But something in the air had shifted. The judgment handed down by Judge Carter, though modest in its immediate effect, had ignited conversations in every corner of the town. It wasn't just about a fine anymore. It was about how the town viewed its people, its laws, and its future. Monique noticed it first in the small interactions. People who had once looked past her in the grocery store, at church, or on the street now greeted her with a nod, a smile, or a brief but sincere word. It wasn't just out of politeness. There was a new understanding, a new respect that had started to grow. Some were still skeptical, unsure about how the town should respond to the changes she had sparked, but many had begun to question the things they had taken for granted, the quiet inequalities, the ways in which people had been made to feel like their voices didn't matter. One afternoon, Monique was having coffee with a local teacher, Lisa, when the subject of the case came up again. "I have to admit," Lisa said, stirring her cup absent-mindedly, "I never really thought about it before, not like that. But after hearing what you said in court, I started paying more attention. Some of my students, well, I guess I knew things weren't always fair, but now I'm wondering what I can do to help. Maybe we can do more to give all the kids a fair shot." Monique smiled, feeling a quiet satisfaction that was far greater than any personal victory. This was the kind of change she had hoped for, the shift from individual action to collective awareness. It wasn't just about her now. It was about all of them. It was about a community beginning to ask difficult questions and take ownership of the answers. At the same time, Monique couldn't ignore the resistance that remained. Not everyone in Maplebrook was ready to embrace the shift. Some people still clung to the old ways, to the comfort of a world where the rules were clear and simple, where the idea of equality didn't feel so complicated. But even their objections, though loud at times, didn't have the same power they once did. The seed of doubt had been planted, and that seed was growing. As for Judge Carter, Monique found herself running into him on the rare occasions they crossed paths. Their conversations, once formal and distant, had taken on a new tone. He didn't say much about the case, at least not directly, but there was an understanding between them now. When their eyes met, there was a silent acknowledgement. The ruling had been more than just about a fine. It had been a step in a larger, more difficult journey. One evening, as Monique sat on the porch of her small house, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt a quiet sense of pride. The work wasn't over. It would never be over. But for the first time, it felt like the town was ready to listen, ready to change. Maplebrook was starting to see what she had always known. Justice wasn't just about laws. It was about people. And people, when given the space to speak and to be heard, could change the world around them.